Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Doug, and many thanks to the 3535 Foundation for hosting this, for having me back. I was privileged to speak here last year and be a part of it, and it was a wonderful experience, and it's great to be back again and seeing some familiar faces from that and some new faces. It's also a real privilege to be here alongside our special guests from Northern Ireland, and that's been a pleasure to see them again. Our family spent 4 happy years there in Northern Ireland, and so to be able to visit with them is wonderful. Crawford Gribben was my PhD supervisor and just a really wonderful mentor, both as a scholar but also just as a godly, humble, winsome Christian man from whom I learn and continue to learn a lot. So this has been a special time. And I mentioned I was speaking, had the privilege to speak at the last conference, and Doug had mentioned in some of his remarks that the foundation likes the idea of some continuity across these conferences, and so that's good, because what I'm going to talk about today in some ways carries on and ties into some of the themes that I've explored in other places. It's less John Owen centric, so for those of you who came out for John Owen, I'm sorry for the next hour, 50 minutes. But for those of you who think, well, okay, maybe enough Owen, how about something different for a little bit? Well, I'm here for you. So, no one's thinking that, Marty. No one's thinking. You never get enough of Owen. But I want to talk about something that isn't too far off the mark, though. The title here is Becoming the Baptists, in quotes, Baptistic Denominational Development at the Beginning of the Long 18th Century. And so I want to kind of connect with some of these themes on when we think about Baptist identity. It raises a lot of questions that are particularly interesting to me. How did these men and women in the 17th century think of themselves, and how did they think of themselves in relation to other theological categories and groups? And to that extent, I pay a lot of attention to labels and think a lot about what they mean. And I want to kind of explore some of those themes again with you here. And to get into it, let's start at a funeral service, 1702. October 4th, 1702, Hercules Collins died. And for many years, Collins had been widely regarded as one of the most distinguished preachers amongst the Calvinistic Baptists. He expounded scripture from his London pulpit regularly. He authored a half a dozen treatises. He did not have any formal educational pedigree, but he still managed to be very prolific as a theologian and a pastor and a thinker. And he was very influential. And his life covered a very influential slice of English history. He was born during the English Revolution, and he died some 13 years after the 1689 Act of Toleration. And if you know something of English history, you'll know that to span that period of time, he would have seen some very fundamental changes in the nature of English life and English religious life in particular. And his lifespan there covers a lot of the events and times and cultural shifts that I think those of us here in this room are quite interested in. And so to that extent, it's interesting to look at his funeral sermon and the remarks made there by another minister, John Pigott, who praised Collins as one who consistently lived what he preached. And he speaks of him as one of the key figures in London religious life. And this is all certainly true. And if you read accounts of Collins and you read accounts of his sermons, he'll be invariably described as a Baptist minister. Baptist, often with a capital B. And that's an interesting label to use. And it's one, I think, that raises interesting questions for us. When someone labels Collins as a Baptist with a capital B, what do they mean by that? What are they trying to suggest about him in relation to other figures? And was that a label that Collins would have used to describe himself? And if it's not a label that Collins would have used to describe himself, how would he have described himself? And to me, labels are very interesting. I'm interested in labels, not kind of for their own sake, but because labels tell stories about the person that we're describing. A label carries with it a whole world of interpretation and comment on the thing being described. And labels can be very powerful in that sense. So for example, are you anti-abortion or are you pro-life? Those are two labels used by different people to describe essentially the same objective referent, but the label tells a very different story and gives a very different interpretation of the thing to which it refers. And labels are doubly powerful because not only do they pack a lot in a short space, but they tell those stories implicitly, don't they? They go under the radar. So when people talk about pro-life or anti-abortion, two different labels, two different stories to describe the same objective referent, it's an implicit story. It's not drawing necessarily attention to itself, and so you carry in a whole world of interpretation with the label. And so they're sneaky. And when we're talking about historical labels, the labels that historians use to describe people in the past, it can be very sneaky indeed. Because sometimes we just get used to hearing a label and we just think, oh, that's what we call those people, that's what they were. And we don't really then pause to think about the way in which that label is actually shaping our understanding of those past actors. So I'm interested in labels. And I'm interested in the fact that though Hercules Collins would be universally referred to in any history book you'd find as a Baptist, and by the way, I'm not against calling him that, by the way. I use that too, but I just think it's helpful to pause and interrogate it. So for example, it's interesting that in this funeral sermon, though every single modern person talking about Collins and his life would use the word Baptist probably multiple times, in the funeral sermon for the man, he's not referred to as a Baptist at all. That word isn't used. Now, maybe that's meaningful, maybe that's not. But whenever you notice something that's really different from like our practice and their practice, that's at least worth pausing and saying, hey, maybe there's something there. So what does Piggott say about him? Well, he talks a lot about his life and where he went and what he did, as you would imagine. He doesn't mention actually his baptismal views at all. He just doesn't mention that aspect of Collins. Instead, when he comes to talk about what Collins believed and what he taught and his theology and his theological identity, we get this. This is a quote. He says, his doctrine, so Hercules Collins' doctrine, was agreeable to the sentiments of the Reformed churches in all fundamental articles of faith. So again, that's just interesting. Guy universally talked about by us today as this Baptist guy, and then you talk to someone who was actually there preaching his funeral sermon, assessing him. He doesn't use the word Baptist. He doesn't talk about his baptismal views one way or the other, and he actually makes a point of describing him as one whose sentiments were agreeable to all the Reformed churches and all the fundamental articles of the faith. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it's interesting. It's interesting. And when we think about that, and we then think about other aspects of Collins' life, we start maybe connecting some lines. So it's also interesting to me that Collins, one of the things for which he's best known is his influential Orthodox Catechism, published in 1680. And in this catechism, the questions and answers that he gives follow very, very closely with the Heidelberg Catechism of 1563, which, of course, is one of the pillars of Reformed Protestantism, one of the three forms of unity that in some ways is definitional of the Reformed faith. And Collins takes that and appropriates it and modifies some things, but essentially follows that pattern. And for Collins, the fact that he's kind of essentially copying something that came before was most definitely a feature, not a bug. He in fact writes that he does this in part to show that he stands in full agreement, quote, with the most orthodox divines in the fundamental principles and articles of the Christian faith. And so who does he mean by most orthodox divines there? Well, presumably a number of folks, but I would think chiefly those emerging from the Protestant Reformed, and indeed Paedo Baptist tradition, folks like Zacharias Ursinus, who authored the Heidelberg Catechism. So this is just interesting to me, and it's interesting to me because in some ways it's not what one might expect. And it's not what one might expect when one reads much of the contemporary literature around Baptists and Baptist history. Often, Baptists in a lot of the literature that's out there, both religious and more mainstream secular, Baptists aren't associated with the Reformed tradition. In fact, far from it. They're often seen to be something different or even contrary to it. So when we see these sorts of things, it's worthy, I think, of our sustained reflection. And again, this is where labels, I think, are so important. And when we come to the history of Baptists, we often see that labels are imposed very quickly. And sometimes those labels are helpful, but other times they're unhelpful. And one of the ways they can be unhelpful is that they tend to potentially, if used without due care, they can project denominational identities onto historical actors who would not have had those denominational identities, or certainly not a denominational identity developed to the degree that the label might suggest. And I think this is what's happened with the history of 17th century early modern English Baptists. And I've written about that in other places, and particularly I've argued that the label particular Baptists, when used to describe actors from within the 1640s and 1650s, I've argued that that label is anachronistic and unhelpful. And in that, I'm not actually concerned about the fact that in the 17th century they weren't really using the label particular Baptist. You do see it emerge from the 17th century, but certainly in the 1640s, 1650s, that was not what they were going around calling themselves. I actually don't argue that we should only use what's sometimes referred to as actor categories. So sometimes they talk about, historians will sometimes argue that we should use exclusively, or at least prefer, so-called actor categories, those labels that were used by the historical actors themselves. I think that's interesting. Ultimately, I don't think that's necessarily a helpful or tenable position. I think it's fine to invent new labels to describe past events. I'm not bothered by the fact that people fighting in World War I would not have used the label World War I to describe what they were doing. Why? Because that label's helpful and it clarifies what was going on. So I don't care about using historical labels only if they were used by the historical actors, but I do think we need to be careful about our labels because we want labels that clarify rather than confuse. So that's some of my past work, and whether you find that helpful or not, I used the term Baptistic Congregationalists to refer to those more commonly referred to as particular Baptists, and some have found that helpful, some have not, and that's fine. But whatever you make of it, that analysis and what I would have talked about last year, if you were at last year's conference, was very much in that space. That's really more talking about the kind of initial emergence of early modern English Baptists in the 1640s, the 1650s, some of the earliest congregations. And what's interesting is that clearly over time, and I was arguing that in the 1640s, the situation was quite fluid and that denominational identities really weren't a thing, that it was sort of an emerging situation, that you had people who were basically Congregationalists who then, for various theological reasons, changed their mind about whether or not it was appropriate to baptize an infant. And that when they did that, it didn't immediately slot them in to some new imagined community of Baptists with a capital B, but rather that was something that developed over time. That was something that was negotiated and emerged only gradually. So that's the argument, but clearly that sense of Baptists with a B, a capital B, did eventually emerge. I mean, that clearly happened, and that clearly is the case today. We have a sense, if you just, maybe it's more complicated for folks in this room, but if you just go talk to Christians generally, you will find that people understand Baptists to be a coherent category, and Baptists are people who practice credo baptism. There's maybe other things that we could talk about, but really that's the pith of it, isn't it? And people talk like that. And the imagined community is Baptists with a B, anybody and everybody who's rejecting infant baptism, practicing exclusive believers baptism. They're kind of imagined to have a unity amongst themselves and a sort of identity. And you see that reflected, for example, there's a book by David Bebbington, who's perhaps one of the most famous Baptist historians ever. And his book is called Baptists Through the Centuries, A History of a Global People. So there you have Baptists conceived as a coherent group that can be traced through the centuries and indeed across continents. So the thing that unites all those people that he talks about is their embrace of exclusive believers' baptism. And they are thus a global people of Baptists with a big B. You see that in other things. This is actually very common. I think it's the default way that we discuss these things often. Thomas Kidd and Barry Hankins have a book called Baptists in America, A History. Similar kind of approach to grouping and conceptualizing these folks. So clearly, this group that I like to call Baptistic Congregationalists, where it was sort of fluid and who are we and where are our relationships to other groups, it's messy in the beginning, and then over time it becomes, at least in some ways, less messy and more clear. And you do get this capital B Baptist identity. But how does that happen? And when do Baptistic Congregationalists become the Baptists? That's an interesting question, and we're not going to settle it today. But I do want to take, in the time we have, just a brief sort of sounding at the end of what sometimes historians call the long 18th century. At the beginning of the long 18th century. At the end, that's a different talk, not on the schedule. I want to take a sounding from, say, around 1703, when Hercules Collins dies, and how far along the road toward becoming the Baptists were the Baptistic Congregationalists. And so to do that, I'm going to have three movements here, and first we're going to talk a little bit about religious toleration and the development of dissent. And then, very briefly, we're going to think about some of the ways during this latter half of the 17th century, so the latter 1600s, we're going to think about some of the ways in which denominational identity began to sort of solidify and crystallize and become more real. And then we're going to move into the last bit where we'll just do a little bit of analysis and ask, okay, so how far along the road to becoming the Baptists are our 17th century Baptistic congregational brothers and sisters? So that's the game plan. I should also say, I think often in life, disappointment is the result of misaligned expectations. So I need to say, in light of the beautiful PowerPoints that were on display earlier, full of photos and early modern documents and other things of rich visual interest, I have like one slide. And in fact, the slide you're looking at now only exists because I couldn't just lead with the one slide that I have. I had to have something to kind of cover it up and hide it. So I have one slide, and then I kind of divided that one slide into three things. So don't get your hopes up, is what I'm saying. All right, now we're aligned. Religious toleration and the development of dissent. So if we're thinking about the development of a denominational identity, we need to recognize that in the history of England and English religious life, that wasn't really possible to begin in earnest in anything like the modern sense until religious plurality was allowed legally within the English context. So for a long time in England, you have one national church, the Church of England. And if you're not a part of that, you are doing it wrong. You are doing something illegal. You could be penalized. England doesn't recognize another option for church going until 1689, when you get the passage of something called the Toleration Act, in which other forms of religious expression are to be tolerated. They're to be allowed. So in other words, Before 1689, though people did meet apart from the Church of England, they did so without the blessing of the state, and they were subject to legal sanction. After 1689, a limited form of toleration was allowed. It still wasn't a free-for-all. It was still quite restricted. There were still sort of things, penalties, and other hardships imposed on those outside the Church of England, but the game radically changed after 1689. And it was the Toleration Act that really allowed, in many ways, something like what we come to know as denominations to start to develop. So the historian David Wykes has observed, he says, quote, "The decades after 1690 represented the crucial period in the development of modern dissent." Dissent being the basket term used to describe everybody who's operating legally but operating outside the Church of England. So this would be people like Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, Quakers. Those would be the main groups during this period that start to develop and emerge. And all of these groups took advantage of this new atmosphere and the new legal space that they were afforded to organize, to gather, to strategize in ways that would have been impossible prior to the passage of toleration. It's not that they didn't do anything prior to the passage of toleration. Of course they did. But again, they were subject to persecution, and psychologically they're carrying the sense that, hey, we're actually doing something that's formally not allowed, and we're very much swimming against the current. And the full significance of toleration, I think, is missed if we focus just too quickly on the new initiatives it allowed. Sometimes when this subject is discussed, people will jump right to, hey, they started building new buildings, and they started holding assemblies, and they started making schools, and all that is important, and it's important when we're thinking about the history of denominational development. But I think the more fundamental change that happens with the passage of toleration is that essentially it dissolves this nexus of centuries-long Christendom assumptions about the relationship between the church and the state, about the relationship of the English church and the English people. For a long time during the history of the Christian church, the idea that the state and the church have some fundamental united interest, and that to be a member of the state in good standing is to be a member of the church in good standing, that those two go together, and that it's natural and right and good that they just go together in this very close way. That was a sort of default assumption across Europe and across Christendom. And in England in 1689, that assumption is not just questioned, people have been questioning it for a while, it's sort of formally broken. As one historian puts it, after 1689, the Church of England remained the established church, but lost its full claims to be the national church. So in refashioning the English landscape this way, the Toleration Act must be held conceptually together with the 1662 Act of Uniformity that preceded it. That was something that was mentioned earlier. Essentially, this was an act that required ministers in good standing within the Church of England to declare their unfeigned assent and consent to all and everything contained and prescribed in the Book of Common Prayer. And so by sort of raising the bar for what it meant to be a part of the national church, to say, no, we're all going to be on the same page, the Act of Uniformity essentially created two categories within England, created Anglicanism with a much more developed sense of identity, and this other category called dissent. So you're either in the Church of England or you're dissenting from it, and essentially between 1662 and 1689, you still have these two categories, but one is illegal and the other is legal. And then in 1689, they essentially say, okay, persecuting everybody outside the Church of England is not working, so now we can have Anglicans and we can have dissenters in their various forms. And you get this real dichotomous view. And actually that still persists today in sort of English religious life. So I taught at Oak Hill College in London, and as a seminary we often would talk about our students, and they knew that it wasn't behind their back, but we categorized our students as either Anglicans or independents. And there were various reasons for that. But that sense that you're either a part of the Anglican Church or you're in this other box with everybody else, the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the difficult to categorize, etc. That's very much kind of the way the mentality works, and it goes back to this period of time. And of course, the 1662 Act of Uniformity is also important because it pushed a lot of people out of the Church of England who formerly were happy within its walls. This would be a lot of Presbyterians who had retained hopes that they would reform the church from within. Puritans wanted to, as a shorthand, they want to purify the Church of England of what they viewed as kind of Romish remnants. The vast majority of Puritans did not want to leave the national church. They wanted to change the national church from within. But after 1662, when the requirements for being a minister of Church of England in good standing are tightened, and anyone who doesn't agree is kicked out, this is the so-called Great Ejection. You have some 2,000 ministers who lose their living, lose their job, and so now all of a sudden the ranks of dissent are swelled considerably. And so this is the situation that we have in this latter half of the 17th century. You have this new world created in 1689 wherein you can legally operate outside the Church of England. And it's at that moment when we start to see denominational identities really start to solidify and crystallize, and they become something more like what we have thought of in more modern periods as denominational identities. And it's facilitated by this passage of the Toleration Act. So, secondly, let me just say briefly about that, and then we'll get to the analysis of the Baptists. Let's say a little bit about this new world of religious toleration. And we're saying that it was after 1689 that Baptists could really start to organize, and this denominational identity starts to crystallize. Well, what does that actually look like? What are they actually able to do? As one historian puts it, he says that it was toleration that finally allowed individual groups like Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers, it was toleration that allowed individual groups to pour their energies into positive self-definition rather than simple survival. So again, you think about it, it's not that these people aren't meeting together, it's not that they don't have a sense of one another as fellow travelers, it's just that it's very difficult to build something constructive and develop it when you're constantly being harassed and harried and you're operating under the sort of, sense that what we're doing is illegal and it's not allowed and it could be shut down at any moment. It's very hard to build lasting institutional continuity under those conditions. So that's what they're talking about. And what we see that's interesting is historians have noticed that after 1689, all the dissenting groups kind of do similar things to help establish this new sense of denominational identity. We are this group, not that group. They all take on kind of similar initiatives. It's not that they all agreed with each other. If they all agreed with each other, they wouldn't need to form separate denominations. It's just that the mechanisms that they employed took on a similar shape. So things like the convening of more and more frequent and better organized national assemblies, for example. The development of new educational initiatives. How are we going to train men for ministry within our particular neck of the woods? The creation of central funds for ministerial maintenance. That's a big one. Remember, the national church pays the salary of the ministers, or at least sets up a scheme in which the salaries can be helped. And so if you're not a part of that structure, how are people going to get paid? So attention there. The construction of new purpose-built church buildings. A lot of the early modern English Baptists are meeting in different places. And then during the period in which dissenters were persecuted, they're often meeting in very creative places, meeting in barns or meeting out in the woods and doing things because it's illegal. Well, now they can actually, raise funds and do a building campaign in the modern sense. Probably not. The writing of denominational histories is a thing that starts to accelerate during this period. So as these changes are happening, people are wanting to tell their story. And what's interesting to me is that all of these things that they're doing there's this sort of, synergy, right? So they do these things because they have this growing sense of denominational identity, but then the fact that they've done these things strengthens the sense that they have a denominational identity. So there's a synergy, right? So, hey, we feel like we're a group of fellow travelers with a distinct identity from other groups, so let's write a history of our group. Okay, well, we write it. Now the fact that we have it and we have it published and it's in print gives credence and weight to the idea that, oh yeah, they're a separate group. They have their own history. And so it's an interesting time where the changes are accelerating very, very quickly. And I think one way that this is illustrated and this evolving sense, if you look at the 4 national general assemblies convened from 1689 to 1692 by English Calvinistic Baptists. During those national assemblies, you have over 100 Calvinistic Baptistic churches from across the country, stretching from Durham down to Cornwall, and they gather to encourage one another, to organize, to pray together, and to cultivate this shared sense of vision and common cause. And there's a letter authored and circulated by 7 prominent London ministers, and it calls for the first of these assemblies. And I think it gives us a meaningful measuring stick for how did English Calvinistic Baptists understand themselves in this time period. So you read the document, and it reflects 2 things at once, I think. One, it reflects a sense that by 1689, clearly there is this strong sense that baptized congregations, to use language they would have used, do have a mutual sense of obligation to one another, a sense of mutual awareness, a sense that, hey, we are traveling together as a unity. Clearly that comes across. But simultaneously, the documents also show that this sense of cohesion and emerging denominational identity is also a fragile thing and in need of strengthening and buttressing. It's not yet fully formed. So for example, the authors speak of, quote, the need to consider the present state of the baptized congregations, not only in this city, meaning London, but also in the country. And when they make that assessment of the baptized congregations across the land, their assessment is decidedly negative. They say, quote, we cannot but bewail the present condition our churches seem to be in. They've been weakened, they say, by, quote, so dismal an hour of sorrow and persecution. So again, this is referring to the period, this is just after toleration, and they're referring to, hey, we've been all these decades now under the persecution of the state, and now our churches, we're not actually where we want to be. They write that the, quote, the strength, the life, the vigor which attended us is now much gone, and the congregations languish, and our beauty seems to fade away. What's the remedy? Well, they conclude that apart from they're saying that they need a general meeting here in London, and they want 2 principal brethren from every county to be sent. And so the hope is that by gathering and convening, a thing that would have been very difficult under persecution conditions, we can actually help to build this and do something positive. But what's interesting to me, again, thinking about labels, the letter that goes out of the churches organizing, it reveals some of that same sense of linguistic ambiguity that characterizes much of Baptistic Congregationalist discourse throughout the 17th century. They clearly have a shared sense of identity, combined with an inability to consistently name and identify and effectively solidify that sense of shared identity. The label Baptist is not used in this document. Obviously then the label Particular Baptist is certainly not used in the document. And instead, the authors identify themselves as representing, they use different things. They talk about themselves as the baptized congregations, or also churches of the same faith with us. So again, clearly a sense of themselves as a group, but still struggling to consistently identify, to name it. Related documents from the assembly produces a whole series of self-descriptions. They call themselves variously Baptized Congregations in England and Wales, parentheses, denying Arminianism. They call themselves Baptized Churches in England and Wales, parentheses, owning the doctrine of personal election and final perseverance. That's even less catchy. And, that's actually par for the course throughout the 17th century, going back to the 1644 First London Confession. This sense of self-definition as almost a negative thing. Well, we're definitely not those folks over there, Who are we? Well, harder to say. Which raises, why? Why is that? And to me, I think that some of that linguistic ambiguity reflects the fact that these are folks who are wrestling with where they sit within the larger landscape of the Reformation heritage to which they clearly belong, but how do they relate to it? That's what they're trying to work out. And interestingly, in the 1689 documents, they also do the thing that the 1644 First London Confession also did, which is to identify themselves negatively by noting that they're not Anabaptists. So in these later documents, it says notes there have been many reflections cast upon us under the name of Anabaptists. So again, we know who we're not. We're not Arminian and we're not Anabaptist. So what are we? Well, they have different labels for that. So again, though, there's some ambiguity, but there is this clear sense of a strengthening identity. The very fact that General Assemblies were convened at all speaks strongly to a sense of shared group identity. And what else? They gathered, in their own words, quote, to consider the present state and condition of all the congregations under our care and charge. So our care and charge. So they have congregations that they say are under their care and charge. That means there's other congregations that aren't under their care and charge, and they know the one from the other. Again, while it's not a modern denomination, clearly we can see that building and gathering steam. They also did things like, of course, adopt a confession, which is well known to us. A huge statement of this is who we are, this is what we're not. They established a common fund, which, again, this idea of coordinated action to support the cause, very much in keeping with the emergence of denominational identity. So what do we make of this? These sorts of actions, as I mentioned, common fund, assemblies, confessional statements, initiatives for ministerial education outside the Church of England, because the schools, Oxford and Cambridge, would not have been open to those who were non-Anglican. These are common across Baptists and Quakers and Congregationalists alike. As the historian B.R. White notes, each of these dissenting groups during this period, each attempting to strengthen its institutional structure with creedal statements and with national and quasi-national meetings. 4 of the groups raised funds for the training of the ministry. 3 groups at least showed some evangelistic spirit, by which I take him to mean not evangelizing for the Christian faith per se, but rather trying to bring more into their own emerging denominational fold. So the common pattern then suggests it's this context of toleration that is decisive in shaping denominational formation. All the groups are doing these things post-toleration, which suggests that it's not just the inner logic of any one of these dissenting groups, but rather it's the common context that they share that's the real motivating and empowering factor. But now we can come to the question that we started out hoping to really think about. Where do we sit on this road from starting as what I'm labeling Baptistic Congregationalists to the Baptists with a capital B? To what extent at the dawn of the 18th century is there this denominational identity? And in some respects, as with so many questions in life, the answer will depend on how you define the terms. So let me posit at least 2 rather distinct ways of thinking about what we might mean when we say that these Baptists are building a denominational identity. And here's where we do get to see my one slide. So I hope it's good. Split into multiple ones. I'm trying to conceptualize this, and I'm thinking about two different ways we could imagine a Baptist denominational identity emerging. And the first one is imagining a group who primarily identifies with a wider Protestant Reformation culture and see themselves as essentially a Baptistic or credo-Baptistic branch on this Reformed tree. And so that's illustrated there. And so a stronger denominational identity in this first sense would mean more elaborate cooperation among Calvinistic Baptists and a more mature sense of their place within and their contribution to a wider Reformed Protestantism. So again, they do have a sense emerging that, hey, we are our own group, we're distinct. It's not ambiguous, maybe like it was initially as to who we are and what we are. We know what we are. So there is a denominational identity emerging and crystallizing, but it's self-understood as a branch on this large tree called Reformed Protestantism. So that's one way we could think about Baptist denominational identity. The second is something different. And here's our second tree. And here we examine the degree to which these folks saw themselves as forming together with all others who rejected paedobaptism a coherent and distinct identity, an identity rooted in the rejection of paedobaptism. And then we have a Calvinistic branch of that tree and an Arminian branch of that tree. But the big root that unites them is this shared embrace of exclusive believers' baptism. And so if you think about the labels, particular Baptist and general Baptist, those essentially, the story they're telling implicitly is this second tree. That the thing that makes these two groups united, the reason we talk about them together is that they're Baptists. They reject infant baptism. And you have a Calvinistic flavor and an Arminian flavor. That's rather different from this first sense of denominational identity, where you have a group of people who imagine themselves, whatever the Presbyterians and Congregationalists thought of it, they imagine themselves as fundamentally Reformed Protestants and emerging as this sort of Baptistic branch on that tree. So which is it, and how should we think about them at the end of the 17th century? And we'll call that first sense, we can call it denominational identity 1, and the second we'll just call denominational identity 2. And my question is, which better reflects the group of people that we're interested in, the signatories of the Second London Confession and the churches they represent? Which of these two better reflects their self-understanding at the end of the 17th century? I'd just say too, if we think about these two trees and where we see expressions of them, that first tree would describe any initiatives in our own day. Think of something like the Together for the Gospel conferences, which were trying explicitly, whatever you thought of those, they were trying explicitly to bring together Baptists and Presbyterians together because they saw themselves as sort of, hey, we're all part of the same tree, but we got a Baptist branch and a Paedo-Baptist branch, and that's okay because the tree is our rootedness in Reformed Protestantism, broadly conceived. The second tree there, I think, is represented in something like the book I referenced earlier, David Bebbington's Baptists, History of a Global People, right? Where the logic is these are Baptists, and yes, he talks about some Calvinistic Baptists and some Arminian Baptists, but the thing that brings them together is that embrace of exclusive credo baptism. And interestingly, that approach was first exemplified not long after Hercules Collins died in 1738, when Thomas Crosby releases the first volume of his History of the English Baptists. He's essentially operating in denominational identity 2 land, because he writes about all the Baptists, and whether they're Arminian or Calvinistic, it doesn't matter because they're all Baptists. So we do see these two things. Again, general Baptist, particular Baptist, using those labels puts you squarely on the second tree there. So what do we think about this taxonomy? And I would think, from my reading of it, it seems evident that at the beginning of the 18th century, the close of the 17th century, the 1703 year when Hercules Collins dies, I would say that English Calvinistic Baptists are rapidly progressing in terms of denominational identity 1. But I think they're showing little development in terms of denominational identity number 2. And to make the case for this growing sense of denominational identity 1, we can review all those things we looked at very briefly, all those denominational-like initiatives to provide better coordinated efforts toward building a positive, enduring, cohesive vision. But we also see that other things that they used to do are falling away. So by the end of the 17th century, we're seeing less enthusiasm for maybe some of the mediating positions that Baptistic Congregationalists once held. Churches like John Bunyan's, where you had Paedobaptists and Cretobaptists sort of together under this congregational rubric. Some of those unusual kind of intermediate forms are sort of falling away. And I think in a post-toleration world, you have less need for such things because everybody can organize on their own terms and you can kind of divide into groups that make sense, and you don't need to sort of band together in the way that maybe earlier periods did. So we see changes happening, and we also see that amongst the 17th century early modern English Calvinistic Baptists, we see that the questions of soteriology continue to be elevated above, in some cases, questions of sacramentology and baptism. Not in every sense, but we see interesting things like this. At the 1689 Assembly, here's one of the questions that was proposed, debated, and resolved by the delegates. The question reads like this. Question, whether it is not the liberty of baptized believers to hear any sober and pious men of the independent and Presbyterian persuasion when they have no opportunity to attend upon the preaching of the word in their own assembly? That's a question. And the answer is concluded in the affirmative. So, translation, they're essentially asking if you're away from your church and you're a Calvinistic Baptist and there is no Calvinistic Baptist church around, can you go hear the preaching of a Presbyterian or an independent minister? Is that okay to do? And that's interesting to me because, one, it does show that they had this sense that, hey, we're a group and they're not a part of our group, because they even had to ask the question. So that is a thing. However, they conclude in the affirmative, yeah, you can go hear those people, that's fine. And what's also interesting to me is that they did not seem to suggest that you should go to an Arminian Baptist congregation. So you can go hear the Presbyterian, that's okay, that's good, do that. If you can't come to one of our churches, go to one of their churches. But the whole question of, well, should you hear an Arminian Baptist, because those churches also are around, that's not even really on the table. The implicit answer is, well, no, clearly you wouldn't do that. You'd go hear the godly Presbyterian. They actually, the document appeals to Acts 18 to substantiate the conclusion, and to Apollos, a man mighty in the scriptures who nonetheless knew only the baptism of John. So from an early modern English Calvinistic Baptist perspective, what a perfect descriptor of our Presbyterian brothers. Mighty in the scriptures, nonetheless, know only a bit about the realities of baptism. So this is very interesting. This is just history, guys. Don't shoot the messenger. And we find other examples. We could multiply these examples where soteriology and unity on issues of what we have come to call the doctrines of grace in our own day, unity there seems to trump any unity one might have over whether or not you should baptize an infant. So I'll give you one more example. This is from Benjamin Keach. Keach is reflecting on his own past, and he compares his early acceptance and then abandonment of Arminianism. He compares it to his very conversion to Christianity itself. And he uses the language of a conversion narrative to convey how dangerous he thought it was to be mired in Arminian soteriology. He says this, he says, "Brethren, next unto the grace of God in my conversion, I have often said, I do look upon myself bound to admire the riches of God's love and goodness to me in opening my eyes to see those Arminian errors, which, when I was young, I had sucked in. So he's saying, look, after my regeneration, this was the most significant development in my spiritual life. Another example from Keach, he describes, quote, the fearful estate of John Child. And he gives this as a cautionary tale. This man, John Child, he was a Christian, and he was actually a preacher. And yet, as soon as Child abandoned his Calvinism, in Keach's words, and turned to be a grand Arminian, everything went downhill in Keach's telling of this tale. And he actually, it's a very tragic case as he describes it. This gentleman actually first he stopped being a pastor and a minister, then he stopped being a Christian, and then he actually took his own life in 1684. And the way Keach tells the story, he presents it as this sort of slide, and perhaps this inexorable slide. You give up the gospel, as Keach would have, I think, felt confident to put it, and then everything else goes away. When Keach lists the sort of people who will be counted as the chaff on the last day, he talks about errors that will shut someone out of the kingdom of God. And he names those, quote, carried away with Arminianism, Socinianism, and anti-Trinitarianism. Those who, quote, disallow of the chief cornerstone God hath laid in Zion. Well, that is theological condemnation of an extremely serious sort. And again, whatever you make of that, and however we might kind of categorize folks today, it's just interesting. Just note, for him, he thought it made sense to list Arminianism alongside anti-Trinitarianism and Socinianism. That to me is fascinating, and when you think about that, it seems highly unlikely that Benjamin Keach was going around in his mind with a denominational identity number 2, if he can write like that. Hard to know, but actually not hard to know. Let me just contrast his dismissal of Arminianism with how he spoke of fellow Calvinists who held to paedobaptism. So Keach clearly regards paedobaptism as an error. He's not a paedobaptist, but listen to how he talks about them. He went out of his way to distinguish between that discrete point, which he regarded as a doctrinal error, and the people who held that view. Here is a representative passage. Keach writes, "Let us bless and praise the Lord for raising up so many brave champions of our brethren of the congregational way. Yet I could wish there was not so much gall in some of them against us, their brethren." He wishes there wasn't so much gall in the congregation against us, their brethren, who in all the great truths of Christianity are of one mind and judgment, and yet are exposed to reproach for witnessing to a truth of Christ, I mean that of believers' baptism. So again, slightly convoluted and harder to hear than if you see it, but essentially what he's saying is he loves his brethren of the congregational way. They're united on all the truths, and the only thing that makes him feel sad is that sometimes he, as a Baptist, takes some flack from them for not holding to paedobaptism. But he's going out of his way to celebrate them and celebrate that unity. Very different from how he talks about Arminianism. And to me, that paragraph carries a very strong sense of denominational identity in the D1 sense there on the chart. Clearly, Keach sees himself as of a different sort of tribe, as it were, than these others, but he sees them as fundamentally united. And as a final contrast, what happens if you have a different view? Well, let me take one quote from an Arminian General Baptist during the period, Thomas Grantham. Thomas Grantham was perhaps one of the key players in the Arminian Baptist or General Baptist world during this time, and here he is writing in 1691. And he writes harshly against Calvinistic soteriology. He decries its principal tenets as dread and blasphemous doctrines standing against the truth of the gospel. Now, in fairness, that level of heat, rhetorical heat, is on par with Keach, but Keach was applying it to Arminianism. He's applying the same level of heat to Calvinism. Point being, these are not people who saw themselves as fellow travelers. And then Grantham says, in making his case, he offers a qualified, it is qualified, but a qualified support of the notorious 16th century anti-Trinitarian heretic Michael Servetus. Servetus, as you will recall, is the gentleman who was notoriously executed in Calvin's Geneva. He denied the Trinity and was quite notorious in doing so. And yet Grantham describes him as, quote, a learned and pious Baptist. And he overlooks, or at least minimizes, Servetus's clear departures from Christian orthodoxy because he sees Grantham as a fellow traveler on the Baptist road. Now that is a very different way of conceptualizing who your fellow travelers are, much more aligned with the second example there. Grantham shows us what a D2 denominational identity might look like. So, what do we make of all this? I would say that clearly by the end of the 17th century, the folks that I describe in an earlier period as Baptistic Congregationalists clearly are well on their way to having a much more robust sense of identity, of denominational identity. They're organizing in ways that weren't possible in the 1640s. They're doing things differently. They're well on the way to a more modern denominational identity. But how do we conceptualize it? And more importantly, how did they conceptualize it? And when I look to the graveside of Hercules Collins, I see a man who is not described as a Baptist and not described as anything like that second tree, but rather I see someone who is counted as one who stands with all the Reformed churches, quote, in all fundamental articles of faith. It's why Collins built a catechism on the Heidelberg model. It's why he was described this way. It's why they viewed Arminianism as such a desperate error, but were very happy to attend the preaching of godly Paedobaptists. And with that, I will close. Thank you very much for your attention.